gonna talk about today social.
Don't be nervous, man.
Sorry, man. It's just the audience.
Exactly. The audience. Let's get into this. So, the fascination of social facilitation all began for bikes. Yeah, that's right. Bikes.
This bike. Not that one.
Damn you, Lance Armstrong.
Yep, sort of that one. In the 1890s, a man named Norman Triplett analyzed cycling times around a track. The intriguing thing he found was that cyclists are significantly faster riding together than riding alone. Because of this, he surfaced an idea that the mere presence of others enhances performances. He tried to prove this by devising an experiment consisting of children winding up fishing reels. The children are asked to reel up as fast as they can, in which some are reeling with a direct competitor and some are reeling against the clock. In the experiment, he found that the children that are racing against each other clock faster times than children who were reeling up by themselves. Based on this, we could see that the presence of an audience improves our performance. But this theory didn't last for very long.
Well, it might seem that being watched immediately increases the performances. Another experiment has shown otherwise.
In the 1920s, social psychologist Floyd Allport, brother of Gordon Allport, conducted his own experiment to prove this. The subjects were to participate in a series of activities: simple multiplication, vowel cancellation, and generating counter-arguments to ancient philosophy theories, where there are also some subjects working alone and working in groups. Like Triplett, Allport found that performance are enhanced by the presence of an audience, but not on all activities. Allport indicated while the subjects who were working in a group produced more counter-arguments to ancient philosopher theories, the strength of the arguments are lower compared from those who work alone.
Isn't those results contradictory? How could we solve this, man? Robert B. Sargent!
So in 1923, there's a lot of bad politics stuff going on, and this cool Polish guy popped out of his mother. His name is Robert B. Zajunk, pronounced like how a German guy would say the junk. Zajunk, but he's everything but a junk. He's a pretty great researcher, pretty influential in psychology. He was fascinated by this thing called social facilitation, which in other words, the audience effect. There's been a lot of cool and weird research stuff done for this topic back in the day, but because of the Second World War, because of this guy, many questions still remain unanswered.
Robbie Z decided to make this article, which basically compiles researches in the area, while both examining them and making a hypothesis. This article is important because the John's examination conclusion is what the world is still using until today. This is because, unlike Triplett, who made the first social facilitation experiment, and Allport, who is the first experimenter whom his experiment garnered contradictory results, he evaluates both sides and added one critical element which makes his hypothesis most applicable in the world of social facilitation.
What's this critical element? We are gonna tell you at the end of this video. Instead, we are gonna explain more about Sir John's article.
He divides this article into 4 subtopics: audience effects, where the subject is observed by an audience; coaction effects, where individuals do the same activity together; avoidance learning, which focuses on escape mechanisms with presence of others; and source of arousal, focusing on chemical components. I hate chemistry.
Let's start by discussing the audience effect. In the Travis 1925 experiment, volunteers are asked for a few days to practice the pursuit of a task, where the subjects follow a revolving target with a stylus for a few days until they are good enough to perform. Then, in the 5th day, each subject are asked to perform without scrutiny for 5 times, and then they would perform in front of an audience of 4 to 8 people for 10 times. In the experiment, Travis found out that there were clear improvement when subjects are confronted by an audience. There's also this other experiment. Pessin asked college students to learn 7 new nonsensical syllables. Nonsensical means words that don't really have meanings. Say sikrpug, mnexigz, or yeah. Some of them are directly observed by an audience, while some didn't. Based on this, Pessin found out that when the subject is watched by an audience, they average 11.27 trials, whereas when they are not watched, subjects needed the only average of 9.87 trials. This shows that audience actually hampers this nonsensical syllable learning.
Next is the coaction effect. One of the more notable experiments in that sector has been conducted by the Chinese badminton player Chen Long, or in other words, the Dragon. It's not exactly him, but his brother in name, Chen, who observed groups of ants working alone, in groups of 2, and in groups of 3. In the first experimental session, each ant was placed in a bottle half filled with sandy soil. The time at which nest building began was noted, and the earth excavated by the insect was carefully weighed. 2 days afterward, the same ants were placed in freshly bottles as pairs, and the same observations were made. A few days later, the ants were placed in the bottles in groups of 3. Chen insisted that there is absolutely no question that the amount of work an ant accomplishes increases markedly in the presence of another ant. Based on Chen's experiment, we can infer that working in groups increases our productivity, well, at least as ants. But there were a couple other guys who says otherwise. Those 2 guys, named Gates and Ali, they devised their own experiment making cockroaches to learn a maze in isolation, in groups of 2 and in groups of 3. They used an E-shaped maze. At the end of the center runway was a dark bottle into which the photophobic cockroaches could escape from the noxious light. It is clear from the result of the experiment that the solitary cockroaches require considerably less time to learn the maze than the group cockroaches.
Based on these experiments we have examined, we can clearly see that there's a contradiction that needs to be reconciled.
After that, it's the avoidance learning. Yeah! One of the most famous avoidance learning experiment that has been conducted is made by none other than Adair and Tatum. In the experiment, medical students, alone or in pairs, were told that they will be seated in a room, and electrodes were attached to their leg, a red button on a table, with the experimenter in another room. Each 10 seconds, the subject receives an electric shock for half a second. The red button has a function to delay the shock for 10 seconds. So in order for them to not get any shock, they must press the red button once every 10 seconds. The avoidance response is considered to be acquired when the subject receives less than 6 shocks in the span of 5 minutes. The results of this experiment was mind-blowing. On average, subjects who were working in isolation needed 11 minutes and 35 seconds to acquire the new response. Of the 12 pairs who participated in this experiment, only 2 of them meet this criterion, and even one of them needed 68 minutes and 40 seconds to acquire it. Wow! Another interesting thing is that when the subjects had already learned the response, isolated subjects tend to be worse than subjects who were working in a group.
Finally, the source of arousal. This part of the article is basically used to evaluate the connection of audience and the increase of drive levels. The only way to prove this is by chemical stuff. I know the other guy hates chemistry, so I'm gonna be taking over. The best indicator for drive levels is from the adrenal cortex because its functions is very sensitive to changes in emotional arousal. Stress usually increases the output of this chemical called, it's pretty hard to pronounce, so I'll just use a robot for this,
hydrocortisone.
Anxiety usually show elevation of plasma levels of
Hydrocortisone.
That's right. Mason and Brady reported this, showing statistics of the
Hydrocortisone.
levels of monkeys in cages alone and together. The average level of
17 hydroxycorticosterone.
in caged monkeys per microgram per 100 milliliter of plasma when alone is 19, while together is 27. While this might seem very certain, chemical and biology is way more complicated, which is why Zhejiang stated that he thinks the connection is still kind of indirect.
Moving on. Now, we're gonna discuss the most important thing in this video. The one critical element that Zhejiang inputted to make all of the previous experiments relevant. That one thing is, drum roll please!
Yeah, complexity of the experiment!
Yes! The complexity of the task!
Zhejiang theorized that when the task is simple or well rehearsed, say professional riders biking, winding up fishing reels, multiplication, or even building nests as ants, having an audience improves our performance, while when the task is complex or unorthodox, such as learning a nonsensical syllable, generating counter-arguments to ancient philosophers' theories, or getting out of an E-shaped maze as cockroaches, having an audience in that situation hinders your performance.
To put a simpler explanation to it, having an audience triggers your dominant response. Why is it this way? A dominant response is a response that you're most likely doing. If you're an expert on something, say dribbling a football, and then you will blossom when the sun is brightest.
On the other hand, when the task that you're doing is really difficult or complex, your dominant response will most likely be the wrong response. So, to conclude, according to Zhejiang, audience triggers the dominant